Hello and welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Basketball Podcast presented by DraftKings Pick 6. I am your host, Brandon Kravitz, joined by RotoWire analyst extraordinaire, Nick Whalen. Nick, episode 1 of the season. Time to shake off the NBA rust. Episode 1 for you and I, getting back on the bike here together. Got to get football off the brain, lock in on everything hardwood, and I think I'm ready to go. I had Magic Media Day yesterday, so
all right.
I feel like that's always the right sort of transition for me to go from the football world to the basketball world, and I'm about ready to go.
Yeah, man, this NBA season, I wouldn't say it snuck up on me because I think you and I, as much as we love football, we're basketball guys at heart, so we're always keeping an eye on things. But I don't know if it was the Olympics or just kind of a generally kind of blah NBA playoffs, but it really felt like compared to years past, there just hasn't been that much like general hype around the NBA season. It's like, does the average sports fan know that the NBA season starts in less than 3 weeks? I'm not sure they do, but I'm fired up for it. We had a bunch of media days yesterday, started to get some morsels, some little bits of news, nothing too major, right? But started to see new faces and new places, and I'm looking forward to diving in on everything fantasy basketball. As we mentioned yesterday, we'll be launching our full podcast lineup this week. So you'll hear Brandon and I every Tuesday through the NBA season. We'll have 4 episodes a week coming your way, and you can catch those on Spotify. You can catch them on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your pods, or hopefully you're watching along live on the RotoWire Fantasy Basketball YouTube.
I'm glad that you reminded me that it's Tuesday because we recorded on Wednesdays last year together. So every time you and I are on, I'm going to think it's Wednesday, at least for the first month of the season. So just be prepared for that out there. It's sort of a transitional year in the league, and we saw, you mentioned the media day stuff, not just from what I experienced in Orlando, but across the NBA. A lot of the teams mingling with the media. We saw Bronny James and LeBron at a media day together for the first time. JJ Redick is now a head coach. The Knicks beefed up in the trade market. And how awkward was that, by the way? A quick aside on their media day scrum, where they're not even able to talk about the trade that went down with Karl-Anthony Towns. Everything was like smoke and mirrors in the way that, because it's not official, it's just being reported on, even though it's on NBA.com. They can't officially talk about their new teammate.
That's how the league works. The official league website can talk about it, but not the players involved. I mean, what an out of nowhere trade. Alex and I, went deep on the fantasy ramifications of this trade on Monday's episodes. If you want to hear a deep dive on that, make sure you check that out. But I'm just hanging out on Friday night. I was actually on a call with my conglomerate about our Circa Million picks, and I get an alert from Shams, and I'm like, what the heck? Like I have a few Twitter accounts, I have like a RotoWire accounts on my phone, and every now and then I'll get these like essentially spam notifications where it's like Twitter trying to like goad me into clicking something. And I'm like, this can't be real. This must be, a fake Sham. So I'm looking at the spelling and I'm like, oh, is this SHMAS? No, it was real, man. I mean, one of the most out of nowhere trades I can remember really in any sport, right? I mean, we're 3 weeks out from opening night, and I was not preparing for Karl-Anthony Towns to be the starting center for the New York Knicks. I like this a lot from the New York perspective. I had a lot of questions about Julius Randle's fit with the Knicks. I think the Knicks also had a lot of questions about that, bringing back, this high usage guy who I think has always thought of himself as like a number 1, number 2 option. And for this team was pretty clearly not going to be that. And if he wanted to, I don't think it was really going to mesh with the rest of the roster. Obviously Towns is maybe an even higher profile player than Julius Randle, but I think he's been a little bit more flexible throughout his career. He's been a little bit more willing to, kind of work alongside Gobert, step aside for Anthony Edwards. And I'm optimistic that he'll be willing to do the same with the Knicks.
So what was the general takeaway as far as who benefits the most, whether guys that were already on both of these teams or players that have now changed locations? Who benefits the most of all of these guys?
Alex and I came to the conclusion that we think it might actually be a net positive for all 3 players involved, or at the very least, not a net negative. Towns would be kind of the big question mark because of the surrounding talent in New York. But you look at, Towns' numbers over the last couple of seasons, like since Gobert arrived, his rebounding has gone way down, right? And like he should be the starting center for the New York Knicks. Maybe at some point they try, Robinson and Towns together. I don't really think that'll be the case. Mitchell Robinson might even get traded. He's hurt right now. Either way, I think getting away from Rudy Gobert will allow Karl-Anthony Towns to return to being a 10 plus rebounds per game guy. Maybe we see the shot blocking come back as well. He's been under 1 block per game, closer to like a half block per game over the last 2 seasons. I think that could rise by default. He was always 1.2 to 1.6 blocks per game before Rudy Gobert showed up in Minnesota. So you still, there might be a little bit lower volume in terms of the scoring. There might be a little bit of clunkiness early on with Karl-Anthony Towns fitting in on offense. But I think in terms of, some of the individual scoring categories for fantasy basketball, there might be an advantage here for Towns. And, Julius Randle's kind of in the same situation, I guess, where there were question marks about how he was going to fit with this new look Knicks team. He's going to have the same questions in Minnesota. But you look at the projected starting lineup right now for the Timberwolves, let's say it's Conley, Edwards, McDaniels, Randle, and Gobert. I mean, you basically have 2 non-scorers in the starting lineup in McDaniels and Gobert, and then a 37-year-old point guard in Mike Conley. So I think in terms of the roadblocks to Julius Randle getting his touches on offense, I think there are fewer in Minnesota than there were in New York.
I mean, this was a guy that we were already pretty excited about in fantasy circles, but I think it helps Anthony Edwards. It feels like part of the reasoning for making a trade like this on the Minnesota side is that they feel like if they're going to be paying somebody max money and their efforts are to win a championship and to have sustained success, that he's the guy that they want to hitch their wagon to, and for good reason. They obviously thought that a ceiling was capped with Karl-Anthony Towns. Otherwise, you don't make a deal like that. I also think there was probably some salary cap reasons that they were kind of up against it, so they had to figure out a way to stay cap compliant and to avoid the luxury tax in seasons moving forward. But it feels like his usage is going to go from high to higher after a deal like this.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is salary motivated, which, it kind of sucks if you're a Timberwolves fan, especially if you were a Towns guy. But, Randle makes literally half as much as Karl-Anthony Towns, and they can get out of that deal, at least a year earlier compared to Towns. And you're also getting DiVincenzo back in this deal too. And I think that's a pretty underrated piece, right? And, DiVincenzo, some of the numbers looked a little inflated last year because of the injuries. And, he was playing 38 minutes a night for 2 months and, taking 10 threes a game. I don't know how sustainable that's going to be, but I think the Timberwolves need somebody like that, right? And I would not be surprised if at some point there is a handoff from Conley to DiVincenzo. I mean, again, Mike Conley turns 37 in 9 days. And, he's still a pretty viable player. He's a nice, solid veteran point guard, but he's not the Mike Conley that he was 6 or 7 years ago in Memphis. And, I think DiVincenzo comes out a winner from this as well. I mean, this is a Minnesota team that I think pretty desperately needed a knockdown, high volume 3-point shooter.
Definitely. They absolutely did. DiVincenzo last year, with all of those injuries and the volume that he was getting, was an ATM in the props market. Yeah. This guy was unbelievable, but you're right. And maybe that's the way Minnesota's going to try and use him, not 38 a night, but try and use him even more so with a healthy roster than what the Knicks were going to. And the reports were that he wasn't as thrilled with the idea of being part of the Nova Boys and all of that. But I want to go back to the offseason moves, the changes that we saw across the league. The Knicks beefed up, just talked about that. Woj retired, which is bizarre. And now he's with the Bonnies. JJ Redick is the head coach of the LA Lakers. Paul George is with the Philadelphia 76ers. When it comes to wholesale changes across the league, what has you the most intrigued as we get ready for draft season and as we get ready for tip-off of opening night?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough situation if you were holding Woj in a dynasty league, and now he retires.
Huge fantasy ramifications.
Yeah, you're not getting any production out of Wojnarowski, who I think was multi-position eligible in most formats. But no, one team that you didn't mention, and I think the changes were overwhelmingly negative for this team, but there was a quote from James Harden at Clippers Media Day yesterday where he was basically like, yeah, we're going to be running things through me. And a lot of people said that, that didn't work out very well in Houston. But hey, the Mavericks did that with Luka Doncic and they went to the finals. For fantasy purposes, I mean, I think James Harden is somebody that I'm willing to completely jump on board with this season. And, it kind of felt like
you've been a Harden guy for the last couple of years.
Well, it felt like a couple of years ago, it's like his career was kind of trending in a different direction. It was like, all right, he keeps jumping around from team to team. He's not really, this crazy high usage guy who's, averaging 33, 36 points per game like he was during his peak Houston days. But he's still one of those guys who, no matter the situation, is always a better fantasy player than it kind of feels like he has been. And that was the case again last season, despite taking a step back in terms of scoring, in terms of overall usage. He played 72 games, which is huge. I think Kawhi Leonard is going to do what he does every year and miss 20 plus games. They no longer have Paul George as a secondary fallback option. I mean, PG was as healthy as he's been in a long time last season. And you look at this Clippers roster, and if you're like me and you think Kawhi is going to miss 20 to 25 games, I mean, that's a huge chunk of the season where this team is going to run entirely through James Harden. All due respect to Terrence Mann, all due respect to Norman Powell, who I actually like as kind of a late round target this year. They brought in Kevin Porter off the streets. They brought in Derek Jones, Chris Dunn, Bones Highland. I mean, none of these guys are really moving the needle. I mean, I think we're set up for a year in which the Clippers are probably going to struggle to make the postseason. I think they're in the play-in zone for me at best right now in what's a really deep Western Conference. But I think on an individual basis, on a fantasy basis, this sets up really, really well for James Harden.
Right now, RotoWire consensus has him at 11 overall. Feels a little bit rich for my blood, especially when you look at some of the guys that are around him. The aforementioned Anthony Edwards, Giannis is ranked right behind James Harden. Does that, I know you have a hand in this, so I'm guessing that that this feels right to you, but it seems like it's I'm not taking Harden there. I'll just say that. I would have to wait until the 20s.
Yeah, I mean, we're projecting Harden for, a healthy jump in terms of assists and scoring. And, I think we were still relatively conservative as far as his scoring goes. We have him at about 20 points per game projected. He was at like 17 last year. But, this is a guy that for, essentially a full decade prior to that, was anywhere between 22 and 36 points per game. So I think we could be a little conservative in terms of Harden's scoring. We'll see. The pieces around him are not ideal, right, in terms of generating assists, but Harden's always a guy who figures that out. You mentioned Giannis. A lot of that is like if you go to our default rankings on RotoWire, it'll typically default to roto scoring. And as we know, Giannis is significantly more appealing in points leagues, and in certain builds for roto, he still absolutely makes sense as a first round pick, but it's the free throw percentage, right? And when you're taking a ton of free throws and you're shooting like 65%, it's going to drag down your ranking in terms of the algorithm that we use. So, Giannis, he's almost like unrankable in some ways, because in some roto leagues you'll see him go later than it feels like he should. In other roto leagues you'll see him still go with like the 6th overall pick, and then you kind of have to build your roster around that. So it's somewhat eye of the beholder when it comes to Giannis. So I wouldn't read too much into, a default ranking for him. But really it just comes down to the, the big hole that he gives you in terms of free throw shooting. And obviously, doesn't really give you anything in terms of 3-point shooting either.
Well, I'm excited to dig into the guy who's number one on your list, somebody that we talked about and argued about at the end of last season. We'll get to that. More coming up on the Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's hear from Nick Whalen and our partners over at DraftKings Pick 6.
We're partnering up with DraftKings Pick 6 this season, and we count down the days until NBA opening night. I can assure you Pick 6 has plenty of NFL offerings for us. You think a certain quarterback will throw for more than 300 yards? How about your favorite receiver scoring a touchdown this week? Check out Pick 6, the newest way to play fantasy football and win cash with DraftKings. Here's how it works. Pick 2 to 6 players of the same sport and choose if they'll have more or less of a given stat. We're talking yards, catches, touchdowns, etc. Lock those picks in, compete against opponents for a shot at huge cash prizes. Download the new DraftKings Pick 6 app right now and use our code ROTOPICK. That's code ROTOPICK, ROTOPICK. New Pick 6 customers, you play $5 on your first entry, you get $50 in Pick 6 credits guaranteed. Again, that code is ROTOPICK. Play $5, get $50 in Pick 6 credits. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 plus. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. 1 per new customer. Bonus is awarded as non-withdrawable Pick 6 credits that expire in 30 days. Limited time offer. See the terms at pick6.draftkings.com/promos.
All right, locked in right there. Nick Whalen's get you set with all of that. We are the RotoWire Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Brandon Kravitz, Nick Whalen. You can drop a comment, and we'd love to hear your questions on today's podcast as we stream live. And I teased it up. I want to get to it now. You said at the end of last year that Victor Wembanyama was your number one player, or that he was going to be heading into the 24-25 season. Is that indeed the case still for you?
Yeah, it is. And, I think there are other viable options here. And, it's interesting when you look at some of the early ADP numbers. There is a little bit of variance here. Like in ESPN leagues, Nikola Jokic and Luka Doncic are both going ahead of Victor Wembanyama. Wembanyama is the number one guy by a hair in Yahoo. He's pretty easily the number one guy in Underdog, which of course is mostly best balls, and that makes sense. It's hard to argue with the upside of Wembanyama. I think the one big concern, would be the minutes load, which started to increase a little bit over the second half of last season. But, even when he was playing like 28 to 30 minutes per game, he was still pretty easily a top 5 guy. And I think there's still, I wouldn't say concerns about durability, because he answered those about as emphatically as he could have last season. Played 71 games. A lot of the missed time was just the Spurs being conservative, holding him out on some back-to-backs, things like that. But I think until he plays like 3 or 4 seasons in a row where he's playing 65 plus games, you're always going to be like, all right, this guy's 7'5". Can he actually, hold up in the NBA? And again, he answered that in the affirmative last season. But I think I'm not going to fault anybody if you want to take Jokic, just because, the durability has just been so rock solid throughout his career. Wembanyama feels a little bit riskier, but I think the upside is ridiculous, man. I mean, we're talking about a guy who could very easily be a 25, 12, 5 assists, close to 1.5 steals, over 4 blocks per game type of player. And, you took over 5.5 threes per game last season. I think that volume could increase. I think you project a slight step forward there. He shot 80% at the line last season. I mean, there are really almost no holes in Victor Wembanyama's game. He said he put on 20 to 25 pounds of muscle over the summer. Look, I think passing on that kind of upside, a guy who could essentially lap the field as the number one overall player. And that's saying a lot when you have some, all-time elite fantasy players like Jokic and Doncic and SGA going off the board behind him. If I have the number one pick, I'm taking Wembanyama, and I'm not really thinking that hard about it.
So, and that's the concern for Wembanyama. I think we all see the talent and where this guy is going. 21 points, 11 rebounds, 4 assists, 3.5 blocks last year. That will be his worst stat line in his career. As good as that was, it is going to get better than that. It's pretty obvious. And then you watch what he did in the Olympics. He's getting better. And the ceiling is the roof, as Michael Jordan would say, for Victor Wembanyama. The issue isn't him. The issue is who you're passing on in order to draft him at number one overall, because you still have these generational icons in Luka and Jokic that are in the thick of their prime. So the concern isn't with Wembanyama. It's the cost of what you're missing out on. I would feel more comfortable sitting there at 3 with those guys off the board, where I don't have to pass on those euros. Yeah. But you're willing to make that plunge. What is it that puts you over the top? Is it the blocks? Because those guys aren't giving you the defensive stats the way that Wembanyama is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit like Christian McCaffrey in fantasy football, where, he was the number one running back last season by like over 100 fantasy points. And you could kind of see a scenario where that plays out with Wembanyama as well. And you're like, man, I understand there is maybe a little bit of risk here. There's perhaps some guys who have similar upside and are a little bit safer behind him, but man, I'm going to be kicking myself if I pass on this guy who's so far and away the number one player.
McCaffrey's a rough comp right now.
Well, yeah, you know what I mean. I mean, hopefully it doesn't turn out that way.
For sure, with multiple tendinitises.
Yeah, we have no indication that Victor Wembanyama is dealing with tendinitis in both of his Achilles. I don't think he's made any trips to Germany that I'm aware of. But no, you're right. I mean, the shot blocking is the big thing, because he could conceivably lead the league in blocks by a mile. He could give you 50 to 70 more blocks than any other player in the NBA if he stays healthy. And we know that's a category of scarcity. It's that, and it's the lack of a hole in his game. It's like you're not really sacrificing any sort of category when you draft Wembanyama. You get that huge, advantage in blocks. You get, elite rebounding. You get potentially elite scoring. You should still have a rock solid field goal percentage. I mean, the fact that he shot almost 47% last year, despite taking a ton of threes, despite shooting 32% from beyond the arc, says a lot. Again, he's a very good free throw shooter. We talked about Giannis earlier, and if you if you draft Giannis, yeah, you get elite scoring, you get elite rebounding, you get assists, you get some defensive stats. But then you have to kind of think about, all right, am I punting free throw percentage in a roto league? Am I going to try to load up on other really good free throw shooters to try to mitigate this? You don't have those questions with Wembanyama. It's like you get all the upside and you still have roster flexibility. And you also get a guy who's center eligible. And in a lot of leagues, depending on how many centers you have to start and what your constraints are there, that's super valuable as well.
My guy is waving the French flag right now. That was quite the case. I'm gonna have a hard time.
It's an easy case to make.
I got a big draft coming up like 2 days before the season starts. I don't know where I'm picking yet, and I'm still you're at least tipping the scales where I will debate it. So a case well made. Is there any concern? Should we have any concern over these guys that just spent all this time playing in the Olympics on a local level? Last year, it seemed like the FIBA World Championships did impact the fatigue level of a guy like Franz Wagner. That can be very case by case, but it was a pretty competitive Olympic Games. You had a bunch of the stars that we're going to be looking at on Team USA and then riddled across the entire globe. Is there any concern over these guys that played deep into the Olympics in July? Is that a non-factor?
Not really for me, partially because, so many players at the top of the board are in the same situation. It's like you can't just say that, oh, it's a huge concern for Wembanyama because Jokic played it deep into the Olympics. Luka played in the Olympics. SGA played in the Olympics. Giannis played in the Olympics. So did Halliburton. So did Davis. So did Embiid. So did Tatum. So did Curry.
Wouldn't it be less of
Kevin Durant?
Wouldn't it be less of a concern for the United States guys because they were so deep? Like nobody was like France was overly reliant on Wembanyama being the guy.
I mean, it's how many games? It's not like it's a full season, though. I mean, it's like some of these guys played like 3 games. The guys who didn't make it out of pool play. You had to go to you have to go to like a mini camp, and it's a lot of travel. I get that, but you've also had enough of a break here. Before the NBA season arrives, that it's really not a concern for me. I think the Olympics are an amazing event. It feels like it drags on, but there's really not that many games played. They're shorter games, like you said, for Team USA specifically. Tyrese Halliburton barely played. Jason Tatum barely played.
Right.
Joel Embiid was playing like 18 minutes a game. So maybe it's more of a concern for like Durant and Curry and LeBron just because of their age. But I don't know that it was significantly more, physical exertion than these guys would be giving in their normal offseason routine anyway. So no, to give you a long answer on that, no, I'm not avoiding guys who are in the Olympics specifically.
So Tatum didn't play. I don't remember that being a topic. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think he played a ton of minutes.
The top 5 last year in terms of total points was Jokic, Doncic, 2 guys that I'm going to have a hard time passing on at the top of drafts, Giannis, Domantas Sabonis, and Anthony Davis. So almost all Europeans, by the way. Of that group, who are you lowest on heading into the season? If you got to lop somebody off and say, no way they end up in the top 5 again, which of that group would you say not happening?
So that was Jokic, Doncic, Giannis, Sabonis, and who?
Anthony Davis.
Anthony Davis.
In terms of total points.
Yeah. I think Davis is the guy that you have to be the most concerned about just because of the injury history. And it's been better these last couple of seasons. And I think he's kind of figured out like the added weight. Last year, if you took a chance on Anthony Davis, you probably got a discount on him. He played 76 games. That was literally the most games he's ever played in an NBA season. And again, it feels like he's been healthier lately, but he played 56 games 2 years ago. He played 40 games the year before, 36 the year before that. So, history strongly suggests that, a sub 75, sub 70 game season could be coming for Anthony Davis. It'll be his age 31 campaign. But everybody's aware of those risks, right? I think if you draft Anthony Davis, and same goes for Joel Embiid to some degree as well, you know what you're getting per game. You're just crossing your fingers and hoping that you get enough games that it's worth it. Sabonis is an interesting case, and Alex and I talked for a while about him on Monday's pod. And, I think he's been about as consistent as it gets as far as games played goes. He's somebody that always ranks higher in total production than he does per game, especially in terms of roto leagues where he does have some holes in his stat profile. But the arrival of DeMar DeRozan, I think, does cloud things a little bit for both Sabonis and De'Aaron Fox. How many possessions does that take away from Sabonis? Do we see a reduction in the assists and the scoring specifically? I think the rebounding should be pretty safe, but DeMar DeRozan, it feels like he's at a stage in his career where you'd expect the production to drop off, but we've been saying that for 2 or 3 years now, and it hasn't really been the case. He's remained a really productive player into his mid-30s, but it's a big variable to introduce in Sacramento.
Yeah, well, and among that group, Domantas Sabonis is the latest being drafted right now. All of them firmly inside of the top 12 as you head into draft season. You mentioned Joel Embiid. He said that he dropped 25 to 30 pounds, which is quite impressive. Now, he's a big man, so you might not be able to tell when you look at him, but that's a big deal. What's the level of faith heading into the season that he's going to stay healthy? Because for me, it's not really there. I mean, it's nice that he's taking his fitness seriously, finally, rather than eating cheeseburgers on a table before heading into a basketball game. But I have such a hard time investing in this guy because I'm so concerned about the missed games.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that dropping weight necessarily eliminates those concerns. I don't know when this weight loss happened, because he certainly didn't look 25 pounds lighter at the Olympics like a month and a half ago. So apparently it's been a quick drop in weight after the Olympics of all times. But I mean, Embiid, the thing with him is he's still been so productive these last couple of years that despite missing big chunks of time, like he missed 16 games 2 years ago, which is a lot. He played 66 games, and he was still the number 2 overall player in total value. The year before that, he missed 14 games and was still the number 3 overall player. Like he's been so like wild statistically that you can almost survive like 15 missed games. Now, if he plays 39 games like he did last year, then that's going to be a loss if you're taking him with the 6th overall pick in your fantasy draft. And this is another team that underwent a lot of changes. Obviously, you're bringing in Paul George. That takes some pressure off of Joel Embiid. We're probably not seeing the crazy high usage. Tyrese Maxey, certainly capable of being a high level number 2 or number 3, depending on how you view that hierarchy. But yeah, there's, the way I draft, if I'm picking 6 or 7 and Embiid's on the board, I'd probably just take Halliburton if he's available. I would take Jason Tatum if he's available. It's like I've even had some mocks where I've reached for Trae Young in the mid first round. I think he could have a huge year. A guy who missed time last year but has a better health track record. I mean, Embiid, it's tantalizing, right? And it's a lot like Anthony Davis, where you know what you're signing up for, you know what the statistical ceiling is, but you're just waiting. You're waiting for that injury, or you're waiting for the meniscus to flare up. And I also worry about this is a Sixers team that I think more than ever is hell-bent on making a playoff run. And Joel Embiid knows that even in years where he stayed relatively healthy, he's kind of run out of gas in the postseason, whether it's been injuries or fatigue or what have you. I would be more worried about him from a load management perspective, in addition to the injury risk, than I would some of these other guys.
Yeah, it's just I never like trying to project or predict what load management is going to look like, because you just never know. You never know how that's going to be utilized throughout the course of the season. And a guy like you mentioned, Anthony Davis, kind of back on our good side when it comes to staying healthy. He played in 76 games last year. So, and we've seen last 3 seasons, or really if you want to go back to the COVID year, but that's sort of I don't know, this would be the year after COVID, would have been an increase in games played over his last 3 seasons. So it does feel like Anthony Davis is starting to shed that profile a little bit of a guy that's hurt all the time. Is it fair? I feel like we can kind of get away from, there's so many other players to be paranoid about. I'm starting to shake some of my Anthony Davis paranoia.
It's still there for me. I'll tell you that, because he's really only had, like I just said, he's only had the one really healthy season last year. And, the larger sample would imply that, this could still be an issue. And, I think, like I said, with Embiid, there's some load management concerns, because I think the Sixers could afford, him missing 15 to 20 games and still be a comfortable playoff team in the East. The Lakers don't have that luxury. It's like if Davis misses 25 games, like you got to pencil in LeBron for probably 15 absences as well at this point in his career. The guy's freaking 40 years old. The Lakers can't weather that. It's like when Anthony Davis is out there, they're going to ride Anthony Davis. They're going to have to run things through Anthony Davis and LeBron like they always do, because, they can't find a viable third option and can't build enough depth. And the West is so stacked up that there's not. I have no load management concerns whatsoever for Davis, but I don't think we're ever going to be out of the woods with Anthony Davis and his health. I mean, it's been a concern like literally since he entered the league, right? And
Yeah.
I'm not just going to say, yeah, draft Anthony Davis and expect 75 games because again, over the last decade, that's only happened like once.
Yes, and that's why I sort of stammered over the COVID year because it was a shortened season because of the missed games and all of that. But he was healthy that year too. So you've seen two healthy seasons in the last 5 years.
That's not enough. That's not enough.
More than I can say for Embiid, it feels like.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's nothing we could say that's going to, just magically convince anybody that these guys are 100% safe. And you know what you're signing up for. That's what it comes down to. You know what you're signing up for. And, I think with Jason Tatum, you're getting a much higher floor. You're getting a much lower ceiling. With Anthony Davis and Joel Embiid, you're getting the ceiling, but you're getting a much lower floor. And it's a calculation that every fantasy manager is going to have to make at some point.
Among the big names in new places, PG-13 and Philly, Cat to the Knicks, DeJounte Murray now with the New Orleans Pelicans. The Kings get DeMar DeRozan. Dallas has Klay Thompson. It feels like some of these are bigger name moves than fantasy needle movers, but among the guys that I just talked about or anybody else that you've seen move from place to place, is there somebody that kind of piques your interest?
I think Paul George is probably the most interesting to discuss. His ADP really varies from site to site. Like in Yahoo, both he and Tyrese Maxey have an ADP of 28.2, which is interesting. They're essentially going at the exact same pick. In essentially every other format that we pull from on our ADP page, Maxey's going well ahead of Paul George. There's like a 20 pick spread right now in ESPN leagues. That one to me is going to be the most fascinating to see how it works out. Tyrese Maxey is the incumbent number 2 option in Philly, but Paul George is the more established player. And I think the give and take between those two is going to be really interesting. And, Alex was talking about Tyrese Maxey on yesterday's episode and brought up an interesting point where, he's like, regardless of the Paul George situation, he thinks Maxey is being a little bit overdrafted. You're basically taking him like slightly above where he finished last season. And you have to keep in mind that, he had an excellent year. Everybody loves Tyrese Maxey, myself included. But over half the season, Joel Embiid was out, right? So like there's elevated production there. And yeah, it could happen again. It wouldn't shock anybody if Embiid, missed 41 games. But there's also a reasonable chance that maybe Embiid only misses 15 to 20 games. And anytime Embiid's out there, you're not going to get that same level of production from Tyrese Maxey. So I love Maxey, the player. I think he's maybe a little bit more valuable in real life than he is in fantasy. Just because of the quote unquote risk that Joel Embiid stays healthy. And then, of course, the addition of Paul George. And this is, it's a team that shed Tobias Harris, but still has pretty reasonable depth, right? It's like Kelly Oubre has been a really nice fill-in on the wing. And, they added Caleb Martin for free. They added Eric Gordon, who always finds his way into like 20 to 25 minutes. Gershon Yabusele is coming over after a Monster Olympics. Like he's somebody that could have a role on the wing as well. So I love Tyrese Maxey, but I don't know that I love taking him with like the 22nd overall pick.
See, this is the frustrating thing with players that get injured is that not only do they ruin the faith that you have in drafting them, but then you also have to factor it into their running mates. So we're downgrading Tyrese Maxey because Embiid might be healthy, but we're scared to draft Embiid because he might not be healthy. This is the mind meld that fantasy creates. Every Wednesday. All right, see, I knew I was going to do that. I already did it. We're one episode in together. Every Tuesday, I will wrap our episode with a new feature that I am calling the bounce. Get it? Because we're ending the episode. The bounce.
Well, and because basketball is bounce.
Correct. So it's a double entendre, if you will.
Wow.
Might have to get like a video made of a ball bouncing. Just
How
a
did you
really.
come up with this?
I mean, ChatGPT, and it's sad that it even took that. I will give you 2 options. You tell me which you prefer. After the trade, you can only bet one at their current price to win the title. The Knicks at 8-1 or the Timberwolves at 10-1.
I would bet the Knicks. No question about that. For one, I think they're in an easier conference still. Boston is the title favorite for a reason, and I don't necessarily see a rationale for why Boston would take a big step back. You're bringing everybody back. There should be kind of a multi-year sustainable winner that the Celtics have built. So obviously, that's the kingpin team that you have to knock off in your own conference. But I still think the overall path to at least, getting to the Eastern Conference Finals is probably easier for the Knicks than it will be out west for Minnesota. Yeah, you got to worry about Milwaukee. Obviously, Philly's going to be better, but I think, teams like Cleveland, Orlando, Indy, Miami, Atlanta, teams like that are all, on a lower rung to me than some of the other contenders in the Western Conference. OKC, Denver, Dallas will be really good again. If Phoenix can stay healthy, they'll be in the mix. And I think the Knicks, if things break right for New York, I mean, they could challenge Boston for the number 1 seed. I think they're built to be a really, really good regular season team, and a team that, as they mesh together, should be able to kind of get this thing where it needs to be in the postseason. So I think the Knicks have the higher ceiling, and Julius Randle's just not a winning player to me. Not that Karl-Anthony Towns has this, incredible track record of winning, but I just like the Knicks roster a lot more. I like their top 7 a lot more than I do Minnesota's. We talked about kind of the 2 non-offensive players. I know Jaden McDaniels has improved over the last couple of years. He's still not a major plus in that regard. And, you still have a pretty big question mark, with Mike Conley. What are you getting from him at this point at point guard? And, again, Minnesota, I think by making this trade, you're not sacrificing a title window because you have Anthony Edwards. They'll still be really good. But I think there's a case to be made that Minnesota got worse here. Like, you got the worst player back in the deal, and they knowingly did that. Yeah. So, maybe the argument is, well, we save money and we'll be able to kind of roll that over and build a longer contention window. I get that, but I think Minnesota probably got a little bit worse in the short term, even as much as I love the DiVincenzo edition.
There are no right or wrong answers on the bounce, but that felt like the right answer. I'm surprised it's even that tight between 8-1 for the Knicks and 10-1 for the Minnesota Timberwolves. I'm with you. I think the T-Wolves, they took a step back to take a step forward. I think this helps them in the future, getting the draft pick that is via Detroit. So that will help in the future. DiVincenzo and opening up some of that cap space and all of that.
Yeah. I don't know if that pick is ever going to convey, by the way. I feel like people saw the Detroit pick. You're like, oh my God, it might be the number 1 overall pick. Like, it's top 13 protected this coming year. Then it's top 11. Then it's top 9. So you're asking a lot of the Detroit Pistons to emerge from the lottery. And best case scenario is you're getting, like the 10th overall pick in 3 years.
Yeah, you had to know there was going to be some protections on it. Yeah. More likely to happen, Ja Morant wins the NBA MVP, or his running mate Zach Edey wins Rookie of the Year with Memphis.
I think it's far more likely that Zach Edey wins Rookie of the Year. No question about that.
He's actually the odds-on favorite right now to win Rookie of the Year, which blows my mind. Well, that's why I brought this up.
Yeah, I mean, Ja Morant's 40-1 for MVP, and it's just, I love Ja Morant, and I think if the Grizzlies are really good and Morant stays healthy and has a great year, there could be kind of a comeback narrative that would propel him here. But you got to get through, like, you got to have a better season than Jokic, Doncic, SGA, Embiid, Giannis, Edwards, Tatum, Brunson, Wembanyama, Curry, Durant. It's like the path to Ja Morant winning MVP is a lot more clouded than it is Zach Edey winning Rookie of the Year. Like you said, he's the favorite. He's not a heavy favorite, but it's sizable. He's plus 550 right now. And then you get Reed Shepherd, who's probably coming off the bench for Houston at 7-1. I mean, we know this is one of the worst rookie classes on paper in a very long time, maybe the worst of the last 15 years or so. So the bar is just not very high. Like, Zach Edey doesn't have to have this all-time rookie year. It's like if he starts 70 games and gives you like 12 points and 8 rebounds and 2 blocks per game, that might be more than enough to seal it, because I don't think there's going to be that many viable contenders.
Which of these 2 veteran guards are you avoiding more in drafts at their current cost? Jamal Murray as a 5th-round ADP, or CJ McCollum in the 7th?
Oh, I love CJ McCollum, man. I draft CJ McCollum every single year, and his ADP like drops 5 spots every single year because everybody's just kind of souring on him, but he's just wildly consistent, man. There's a lot of changes in New Orleans. I think more changes could be coming at some point for the Pelicans, but every single year, CJ McCollum is just rock solid, man. I mean, it felt like he had a bad year last year, and he was still the 51st overall player in fantasy. He was 42nd in terms of per game value. Like, he's somebody that's been in so many different situations. He's had different teammates throughout his career. He's been on 2 different teams, and he's just kind of the same guy every single year. And it's not exciting. I'll say that. Nobody's fired up to draft CJ McCollum, but right now you can get him. Where is he going in Yahoo? He's going pretty late. He's going about pick 79 overall, I think there's a pretty reasonable chance he could once again be like a top 50 to top 55 guy. And, with Jamal Murray, yeah, I think they're going to ask more of him this season, but he's always been a better like single game playoff performer than he has regular season guy. He's had injuries. He typically goes through kind of wild swings in production in the regular season. I don't know if there's a ton of upward mobility for Jamal Murray. So I'll take the guy that I could get 2.5, 3 rounds later.
Nice, solid, boring pick. Last question. Grade the bounce on a scale from 1 to 10. 10 being awesome.
Okay. I'm going to give the name an 8 because I just love this, this basketball's bounce. I mean, I'm puzzled with how you thought about this. But I'm going to give it an incomplete because we got to see more. We need more of a sample. I can't grade this after only one edition of the bounce. But I love the idea.
That's fair. That's fair. He's a tough nut to crack, ladies and gentlemen. That'll do it for us this week on the RotoWire Fantasy Basketball Podcast presented by DraftKings Pick 6. I've been your host, Brandon Kravitz. He's the expert, Nick Whalen, and we'll see you back here next week.